Thank you for tuning in to another broadcast of Through the Storm, a show about finding hope in God while experiencing the various trials and tribulations of life. I would like to say welcome. We are so happy that you are joining us. We have a very special show, and I would like to let you know that the subject matter for this show may not be suitable for young listeners, and you may want to preview it before allowing it to be heard by young listeners. My name is Chantelle Johnson. I'll be your host, and I'm the clinical director and owner for Soul Care Christian Counseling, which is here in Charlotte. I have a very special guest today, Miss Saudia Upright. She is a licensed professional counselor associate, and she's one of our counselors with Soul Care Christian Counseling, and I'm so happy to have her here. And our subject for this broadcast is on sexuality and spirituality. And Saudia, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
And I'm going to allow you to kind of just jump right in.
Oh, okay. Part of what we do in Christian counseling is we see a lot of different types of situations, and we work with people who have many presenting issues, and they seek Christian counseling because it has that added benefit of spirituality. One of the things that most people are confused about is how sexuality and spirituality tie in, because it's usually considered to be two different things. There's a secular understanding of sexuality and how sexuality is in our society.
Right.
And then there's the idea that, oh, if you're spiritual, you can't have a sexuality, or sexuality is something we don't talk about.
Exactly. Yes, sexuality is not something that we're usually comfortable talking about in most circles.
Right.
But definitely when we think about Christianity, it's usually a subject that's kind of considered taboo.
Right.
Or
Absolutely.
kind of hush-hush or something.
It is. It's a very quiet subject, and what's interesting about it is that sexuality was designed by God.
Yes.
So when we take the spirituality out of it, it becomes very different.
Right.
And the intent of sexuality is no longer aligned with what God designed it for.
Okay.
So when we look at sexuality from a spiritual aspect, it's very similar to the Trinity, in the sense that, in fact, God sent us sexuality as a way for us to experience the oneness that's experienced in the Trinity. Okay. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit know each other in fullness, in completion.
Okay.
There's no area of unknown in the Trinity. And God has gifted humanity with that type of knowledge, which is knowing your partner with that oneness. In fact, in Genesis it talks about how Adam knew Eve.
Yes.
And the term for sex is, the translation is to know, a deep knowledge.
Okay.
So when you take away the spirituality from it, it can lead to a lot of pain. And sexuality has been distorted by
very much
from the beginning, since the beginning, since the fall. It's been distorted. If you think about it, it's interesting that when Adam and Eve first fell, they became aware of their nakedness, and what's the first thing they felt? It was shame
and guilt.
Right. And that's what translates into our relationships going forward.
Okay.
So to heal people from that sexual shame, we have to incorporate the spirituality aspect, the way God designed it, back into our lives.
Okay. And in Christian counseling, I know we work with a lot of couples. Sometimes does sexuality, does it often come up? Is that one of the reasons that people come in, or do people come in and maybe that's somewhere lingering in the background that you may have to bring up? Like, how does that come into play?
Actually, it's a little bit of both. We, as humans, we're sexual beings, so we can't isolate that part of us. But a couple may come into the counseling session, or it could be an individual, and they're just seeking help with one particular area in their life. But with a careful analysis, we discovered some sort of abuse, some sort of trauma, childhood trauma, that distorted the way they look at sexuality and their sexuality, because that then interprets to their relationship with their God, whatever, their understanding of God is. Because your relationship with God has an impact, your sexuality, I should say, has an impact on your relational quality with God. So if you have shame, then you're translating that into your relational quality with God.
Okay.
So different people come in from different circumstances, and they may have experienced different types of pain that they're translating into their relationship with God. So there's a distorted view of God, which is why I use the phrase their God, because that might not necessarily be the true relationship with God, the way God truly designed it.
Okay, that's an interesting way to look at it.
It is. It's a different, because people come in with their image of God.
Right.
We often come in with our own image of God, and our image of God is usually laced with our experiences.
Okay.
The way we've experienced life, we learn to translate God.
Okay.
And there's a reason why it says God created man in his image.
Right.
But we often, in our finite minds, create him in our image.
That's true. That is true.
And that's why we have that disconnect.
Okay. Okay.
And just to understand the significance, sexual trauma is something that has impacted a lot of people.
Yes.
We see that a lot in our line of work. And it can be something very severe, something very subtle. It doesn't matter. The impact is still there. And we have to address it. And the way that it impacts a person, we have to understand at that moment of the trauma, it has impacted their spiritual growth, their emotional growth, and their understanding and maturity. So they're relating to the world and relationships and God, ultimately, from that perspective of a traumatized individual at the age that the trauma occurred.
Okay, okay. So it sounds like what you're saying, many of the people that come in for different reasons for counseling maybe have experienced some type of trauma, and related to that is a certain amount of shame or guilt, a worldview impacted by that experience.
Absolutely.
And so you're doing an analysis. You mentioned that you do an assessment.
Yeah, an assessment.
What are some questions? I don't know if you could share some of the questions you might ask someone.
We usually ask about if there's a past trauma history, or if there's any indication or any instances of any kind of abuse in the past, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, even medical abuse. We analyze that, and part of that is to determine if there's any kind of occurrence of trauma, because trauma is very subjective. One person's trauma is not the same as another person's trauma. We as clinicians understand that trauma in itself has an impact, but what could be considered traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another. So we do not want to minimalize anybody's trauma.
Okay. And there's no one size fits all.
Exactly,
assessment.
Absolutely not. And by understanding that, you have to really meet the person where they're at. And to bring it back to the sexuality and spirituality aspect, because we are sexual beings, our trauma tends to impact us in those areas of our sexuality, the way we relate, the way we are, the way we carry ourselves, the shame and the learned messages, the different things that we've learned in childhood pertaining to sex, pertaining to our sexuality. There's so many hidden messages that
we receive.
Absolutely. Whether it's from TV, the media, our parents, different undertones and things that basically teach us the same shame, and that's the shame we carry into our relationship with God. That's why a lot of people approach God like, what can I do to earn your love? But God gives it freely. Right.
And that's something, a behavior or mindset that they've learned possibly at a younger age.
Absolutely.
Okay. And with parents, I'm sure there's some parents who are listening in. Are there some things that they might need to know in order to share?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As this might sound strange, but especially because we are Christian counselors and because sexuality is such a hush-hush subject. But it's important to talk about sex with your children, because if you don't, the world will.
Right.
So what's the message you want to teach children?
Right.
The idea is that if you speak to your children freely, not saying you have to be elaborate or detailed, absolutely use precaution and be age appropriate, but if you don't present it as a taboo subject, your child will feel more comfortable approaching you.
So they pick up on your attitude.
Absolutely. Just like clinicians,
sex.
if we have any hesitancy or if we feel nervous,
it's going to come across.
Yeah, absolutely. Then the client will feel like, okay, because sexuality is something we kind of pick up off of each other. We're, like I said, we're all sexual beings.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be just the act, it's just the way we relate.
Right.
It's the main thing to know about sexuality is that it is an intimacy that's all inclusive. So you can't have a sexual encounter with your body and leave your spirit in the car.
It's all connected.
It's all connected. You have to be completely connected. In fact, your brain releases a chemical called oxytocin during the act, and that's to bond, to get closer. And so people who have a distorted view of sexuality and have maybe been mishandling sex or have been abused may have difficulties with releasing that bonding chemical. Or they might have challenges, or they might bond too quickly, or it's kind of like a piece of tape. If you keep taking it and sticking it and unsticking it, it'll eventually lose its stickiness.
Right.
And the effect is the same for sexuality. So it's the way God intended it is to be a complete union between two individuals, a husband and a wife, who are in complete oneness, who know each other.
Right.
And that level of connection that comes from two people who know each other.
Okay.
But when sex becomes distorted, it affects every aspect of our lives.
Right. And you mentioned, we are sexual beings. A lot of times people don't realize that if they're in a traumatic situation, they feel some shame because their body may respond a certain way, and it can cause a lot of confusion. But God made us, to respond to touch, in different places, and that's something that God gave us, but to be exercised in the right context.
Absolutely. I work a lot with people who have been victimized in the process of. Well, actually, I did actually get my provisional credentialing as a victim advocate. But that's one of my that's one of my areas that I have a passion in, is working with people who have been victimized, especially in this area, which is sexual assault or abuse. Okay. And one of the common things that I see is that there's a lot of self-blame because, I must have liked it because I allowed it to happen, or my body reacted, so I must have liked it. So you see similar themes like that, and what happens is that it adds to the distorted view, our limited understanding, because the understanding becomes very compromised at that moment when the assault or the trauma takes place. Your mind goes into shock. And so in self-preservation, your mind will try to find ways to justify it, rationalize and normalize it.
With it.
Right, absolutely. Because what's the alternative? To have a complete meltdown? That's not usually the way people will react.
Our defense mechanisms
absolutely.
will kick in,
we go into we become shell shocked in a way, and people look at that as say, well, I didn't stop it, so that means that I must have allowed it. I reacted or I responded. Sometimes it felt good. I must have allowed it. I was complicit. It is very, very important to know that just because your body has a physiological response, that does not mean that you allowed it. Right. You have to be very clear. Like we said, mind, body, and spirit, it's all inclusive. Yes. So just because your body reacted to it doesn't mean that your mind and your heart was connected to it.
That's a great way to look at it. That is a great way to look at it.
It's important because it is one of those things that it's a hindrance for many people who have been victimized because they feel like they are responsible. And it goes back to the whole victim blaming and process. And it's very important to know that it's not the same thing. It's completely separate.
Okay, that is very good to know. And I really appreciate you sharing with our listeners this perspective because it's new to a lot of people. I know when I was growing up, we got a lesson in school on sexuality, showed some videos, some things that would happen to our body, but a lot of things involving sexuality I didn't know directly. I got a book on becoming a woman, and I've heard other people say they got something on becoming a man, which is not the same. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Miss Saudia Upright.
I ain't going to college. Wow. My name is Marlo Prelo, and this is a book that I've authored that just came out this year in 2017. I'm very excited about this piece. This book really talks about and inspires the youth to have a plan for your life after high school. It goes into a lot of different stories about things that I've gone through in my life. And I'm just here to say that if I can do it, you can certainly do it. I Ain't Going to College. It's available now on Amazon. You can also find it at www.careerbounds.org. Because I did go to college.
And we're back. Thank you so much for tuning in with us again. We're talking, and I just want to say again, if you have young listeners, the subject matter for this broadcast may not be suitable for young listeners, and you may want to preview it before allowing youngsters to hear the discussion for this broadcast. We have with us today Saudia Upright, who is talking about sexuality and spirituality. And I would like to, I guess, find out from you, Saudia, when people have experienced sexual trauma, what are some ways that it may show up later in their life? You mentioned earlier that people may get stuck at a certain age where they had sexual trauma. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. It can show up in many different ways. One of the ways that it can show up is the relational quality an individual has with his or her partner, spouse, significant other, if it's premarital or if it's an individual counseling session. Your relationship with your children, it can show up in that. It can show up in your relationship with your parents, and also the dynamics, basically any household dynamics, it can show up in many different ways. And one of the ways that we know that it shows up is when the behaviors of the individual do not align with their chronological age. So if it seems like they're acting like they're younger, or they're relating from the perspective of a child, in terms of their understanding or different ways, you can kind of tell just by talking to the person and interacting.
Mannerisms and behaviors.
Absolutely. Well, even subtle things where they might share perspectives, and you can tell that this is not the perspective of a parent relating to his child, or of a wife relating to her husband. It's the perspective of a child.
Okay.
It could be displayed in behavior that's very needy. It could be displayed in behavior that's very fearful, very afraid of rejection, spiritual immaturity or lack of spiritual growth, things like that. So there's many different ways that it shows up. And the main thing that we as clinicians do is we first ask the question. They don't always tell you the truth.
Right.
They don't always, because it's a difficult subject.
And trust is often an issue.
It is,
They don't know
absolutely.
if they can trust you with that information.
Absolutely,
They may
it
have
is.
never told anybody.
Right.
So-
In most cases, I've worked with people who I've seen for, I want to say, over 20 sessions, and then they disclosed. And that's because, and it happened by accident. You know, it didn't happen as a result. In fact, in the initial assessment, they might deny it and say, no, this never happened. But the clinician will kind of start to suspect it based on the
Presentations.
Absolutely, through the therapeutic process, we'll start to start seeing it. When we start seeing behaviors where somebody's very focused on getting approval, getting acceptance, doing for others, very servitude, things like that, you can kind of start to see it, because there's this desire to find worth, validation that you get from somebody else because it's lacking from within.
Right. Okay. And I wanted to also ask, we're hearing a lot in the news lately about people who are being brought out for, sexual improprieties from many years ago, and losing jobs. How does that play into sexuality and spirituality? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing issue, and it's been an issue in I think as long as humans have been created and since the fall, because it has such a profound impact. Sexuality is all the basic commandments that relate to sexuality. When it comes to sin and sexual sin, that's the only group of sins that have to do with the individual self. So that's the only sin you commit against your own body, right? Okay. And so even if you're engaging in an inappropriate relationship with another person, you're still hurting yourself, and you're damaging your sexuality. Because again, if that's the way we relate to God, we're damaging the vessel.
Okay.
So it's self-sabotage. Whatever way you look at it, it's still going to hurt you. And the secular world, the understanding about sexuality is so distorted that it promotes this image that you have to be this way, you have to be that way, you have to be promiscuous, or you have to do this or be exploratory and all that.
And it's kind of focused on getting.
Absolutely. But what it does in the process is it damages the vessel, which is you. It damages the temple. I mean, if we are the temple and God resides in us, then are we desecrating the temple by engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior? And so it has a lot of impact, and it often is not seen with the naked eye.
Right.
It shows up in very different ways, and it can transfer generationally. Okay. The sins, or the curses of it's generational curses, it's generational patterns. It's behaviors that we teach our children subtly or maybe overtly that transfer, and they then learn these behaviors and they act according to it, and their sexuality is dampened because of things because of our distorted view.
Okay.
Because we are the permanent markers for our children. We tell them basically we're the first introduction to their reality.
Yes.
So we set the stage for them, and then they think, okay, this is the world. This is the concrete, and that's what they go with.
Right. And it's just that's a good way to look at it too. As parents, like kids, at some point they start to ask questions, and we have so much technology. It's really hard to hide sexuality. Like if it's something that you want to wait until that child is old enough, where you think they're old enough to handle that information. You really don't have that option, because just standing in the line at the supermarket, kids are looking at the magazine, like,
right.
The commercials that we show sexuality is all around us. So it's that role for the parent to train the children with that becomes very, very important. What are some ways that parents might be able to start to have those discussions with their kids, or what can be done in the home?
One of the main ways is first to be open to your child. Again, if you show hesitancy or embarrassment, that's what your child will pick up on. So making sure that you're letting them know and you're answering their questions appropriately to their age, of course, and keeping that in context is important. Also, keeping it in context of the way God designed it. You don't have to tell your children that sex is bad, because that's what most people end up doing, is telling their children, oh, sex is bad. That's not the truth. That's not what God says. I mean, Song of Solomon talks about how wonderful it is. So, but it's good for in the right context. So you have to. I for some reason I keep wanting to bring this up, but I had heard a podcast from Tony Evans, one of my favorite preachers, and the way he put it is, that's actually the model I used when I spoke to my son about it, which he said, you don't take your fine china out for just your everyday eating. You take it out for special occasions.
Right.
You take it
That's
out
a
for
good way to
special.
look at it.
It's designed for special occasions. He even mentioned furniture, where like you back in the old days, your mom used to put a plastic cover on the couch, and when the important guests would come, that's when you would take the plastic cover out.
That's right.
That's how God designed sex. That it wasn't to be misused, because it loses its value. It's so sacred. It is very sacred, and so that's one of the things that parents have to communicate to their children, is the sacredness of sexuality and their sexuality, that they are precious to God.
They're valuable gifts.
Absolutely. You're not just an object. God has created you to feel, to enjoy, to experience. And that is in itself a unique gift. It is priceless. God created that and said, it is good. He created that and said, you are my masterpiece.
Yes.
So those are things that God has given us, and we distort that. So we don't want to communicate that message to our children. We want to show them how priceless they are, how unique, how worthy they are.
Created in God's image.
Absolutely, and you have to take that seriously. So keeping that in context, I think, is important, and communicating that would probably be a very good way.
Okay.
And meeting them where they're at. It's difficult, I'll be honest. It's difficult, but it's necessary.
It's necessary. And what are some things, because this is not a subject that we often discuss in churches, in our houses of worship,
Right.
what are some things or some ways that churches might be able to speak about this to their parishioners? Because people often come to church with trauma and different things going on in their life that may not be addressed in the pulpit. Is it something that should be addressed in the church, or if so?
I think with care and with the proper message, anything can be addressed in the church. If it's dealing with trauma and how to, an introduction, or just letting people know, hey, there's help. Go talk to a professional. These people are trained. They know what they're talking about. They have spent hours working. They know how to help you. That would be a good place to start. If churches are quiet about it, then somebody else is going to talk about it. There's no, whenever there's a vacuum, something's going to fill it.
Right.
So we can't create empty spaces, especially in the matter of sexuality, because it is from God. It is God's. It is God's. And we have to claim that. We have to understand the impact of it. We have to understand the importance, the sacredness of it. And it is absolutely a discussion that churches should be having. Rather than shying away from the subject and leaving it for the world to interpret, we as the church have to be vocal about it and say, this is how God designed it, and this is the appropriate use of it.
Yes. And it's a natural God-given gift.
It is.
That He's given to us, and it has practical purposes for reproduction, but it's also something to be enjoyed within the right context.
Yes.
Okay.
Within the right context.
And are there any parting words that you would like to give our listeners?
Just if anybody is struggling with any kind of trauma, seek the help, because there are people who are out there who know how to help. And integrating the spirituality in the care will give you the understanding of how your sexuality has been impacted by the trauma. And also talking about how your spirituality can improve and how you can grow, because just because you've had a traumatic past doesn't mean that's the end.
Right. There is always hope.
There's always hope. There's always a way to grow from there. There's always a road back home. There always is. And God He is impacted by it as well. He wants us to be whole.
Yes.
He has a vested interest in us being whole, and us being healthy, and us being happy and full, because we are His body. I mean, we're His people.
Yes,
we're His children.
Yes.
So what parent doesn't want
good things?
Right, absolutely. So you want restoration, and that's what is so important about Christian counseling, is that it incorporates that the understanding of the spirituality, because we are in and of ourselves as form of a trinity. We have a mind, we have a body, we have a spirit. So we have to integrate that part in the counseling.
Amen. Thank you so much, Saudia.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you coming on and being with us. And, you know, this is exactly the message that we want to share with our listeners. At Soul Care Christian Counseling, you know, we believe in creating a non-judgmental, compassionate atmosphere, a safe place where people can come and bring themselves, you know, we meet people where they are. And there are people that want to listen, who are trained to listen and to help deal with the various issues that people go through, including sexuality. And because we are Christian counselors, we are able to use the Word of God as a standard. And, you know, we don't have to guess, you know, God's thoughts about certain things. We do have that as a standard. And, you know, we're there to help. We care about your soul and your person, you as a whole person. So I want to thank you all again for tuning in to Through the Storm. And our show comes out on Tuesdays. And you can look for us. And if you ever have any questions or suggestions, feel free to reach out. And like I said, we're with Soul Care Christian Counseling. And I'll give you our phone number. It's 980-613-8312. Our website is www.mysoulcare.org. And if you ever need a person to talk to, please give us a call and we'll be there. We care and we're here to help. Thank you again for tuning in. And thank you, Saudia, for blessing us with this topic, much needed topic we needed to hear about. Thank you very much. See y'all soon. Bye.